He built a life that looks like proof of success. The alarm rings at the same hour every morning, not because it has to, but because it always has. Coffee is prepared with the same precision each day, measured, reliable, familiar. The calendar is engineered to remove uncertainty. Each hour is assigned. Each task has a place. Bills are paid early. Messages are answered quickly. Problems are solved before they grow teeth. From the outside, nothing appears broken. Everything works. But when everything works perfectly, what exactly is left to question? And when nothing is questioned for long enough, what begins to disappear without being noticed? Because everything works, nothing is examined. A functioning life becomes evidence. Evidence that effort paid off, that chaos was defeated, that this is what adulthood is supposed to feel like. Stability becomes proof of maturity. Routine becomes identity. Predictability becomes safety. But when safety remains uninterrupted, does it still protect? Or does it slowly change its function and begin to numb? There is no dramatic failure here. No collapse. No single moment he can point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." The danger is quieter. A system that runs without resistance slowly stops requiring alertness. If nothing pushes back, why would awareness stay sharp? If nothing disrupts the flow, why would instinct need to speak loudly? Desire does not disappear. It fades politely, without protest, without demanding attention. He does not feel miserable. That detail matters. He feels capable, functional, like someone who has his life together. But isn't that feeling itself the strongest argument against change? Why disturb what works? Why risk instability when stability has been so carefully constructed? And yet, what happens to a man when his life no longer requires him to be fully present? From an omniscient distance, this is where the real tension begins. Not at failure, but at over-optimization. At a life designed so efficiently that it no longer generates friction. At a routine so reliable that presence is no longer required. He keeps moving, producing, maintaining. But when a life stops asking real questions of the man inside it, what begins to quiet down? Take a break here. Look at the parts of your life that work very well. If this seems uncomfortable or familiar to you so far, keep watching, because from here on out, you'll discover why this pattern always leads you to the same place. What begins to change is not his attitude, but the system beneath it. This is not a matter of discipline or mindset. It is biology responding to context. Energy is not a personality trait. It is feedback. A living report of how much engagement the environment demands and how much adaptation the body believes is necessary. When the world asks for alertness, the system invests. When the world becomes predictable, the system conserves. Is that weakness or intelligence? Drive, assertiveness, tolerance for risk, appetite for effort, these are not fixed qualities. They are adaptive responses. When uncertainty and consequence are present, the body pays the metabolic cost of intensity. When outcomes are guaranteed and routines repeat, urgency dissolves. And when urgency dissolves, why would the system continue to fund alertness, initiative, and edge? Testosterone, in this view, is not a badge or a score. It is a signal of engagement. When days repeat without variation, when decisions carry no real consequence, the signal quiets. Nothing breaks. Nothing malfunctions. The body listens and adjusts. So why does motivation fail so reliably in comfortable lives? Because motivation cannot replace necessity. The nervous system does not respond to slogans. It responds to demand. From the outside, this adaptation is invisible. The man still functions. He still performs. From the inside, it feels like volumes slowly turning down. Thoughts remain sharp enough. Skills remain intact. But the charge behind them weakens. The edge dulls. The hunger that once pulled him forward loosens its grip. Is that a personal decline or a logical response to an environment that no longer asks for intensity? This is not betrayal by the body. It is cooperation. The system allocates energy where it is needed and withdraws it where it is not. In a life optimized for comfort and predictability, vigor becomes unnecessary. And what becomes unnecessary eventually slips out of conscious reach. The structure remains intact. The man remains functional. But beneath the surface, the system has already begun to power down. Think about it for a moment. If energy is a thermometer, what has your environment been telling your body lately? Now you will understand how this applies to everyday life. long before it is identified as a problem. His days begin to feel scripted, not because anything is wrong, but because everything is decided in advance. The alarm sounds. The body moves. The routine unfolds without negotiation. Coffee, commute, calendar blocks, meetings that resemble yesterday's meetings, tasks completed efficiently, meals eaten with little attention, evenings dissolving into familiar patterns that require minimal presence. Sleep arrives on schedule, not because the day demanded rest, but because rest is assigned. From the outside, this looks like reliability. He shows up. He follows through. He keeps things running. Other people depend on him, and he rarely disappoints. Inside, however, something subtle begins to shift. The internal signals that once interrupted thought, impulses, instincts, sudden urges, lose urgency. They no longer interrupt. They suggest. They whisper. And when whispers are postponed often enough, don't they eventually stop trying? Emotional range narrows, not into numbness, but into neutrality. Highs flatten. Lows soften. The result is balance without vitality. Conversations become efficient exchanges rather than moments of connection. Opinions become safe. Curiosity gives way to certainty. Days blur together, not because they are painful, but because they are indistinguishable. If every day feels the same, how would the system know when to mobilize energy? This state feels reasonable. It feels like maturity. It feels like control. And that is precisely why it goes unchallenged. There is no crisis to force reflection. No obvious loss to mourn. The erosion is gradual, almost polite. The system does not revolt. It adapts. But adapt to what exactly? A life where nothing unexpected happens. A life where friction has been engineered out. He notices small shifts and dismisses them. A reduced urge to start new projects. Less excitement at the thought of challenge. A tendency to choose the option that preserves energy rather than tests it. None of these feel alarming alone. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns, once established, don't announce themselves, they normalize. The autopilot is efficient. It protects him from chaos and waste. But it also removes friction. And without friction, nothing sharpens. Nothing demands full presence. The man remains capable, competent, and composed, yet increasingly disengaged from the act of living itself. If presence is no longer required, what happens to the parts of him that exist to respond? Notice the moments in your day that run entirely on autopilot. Don't judge them, just observe them. The cost of this silent efficiency becomes impossible to ignore. Awareness does not arrive as pain. It arrives as absence. Not the absence of function, but the absence of charge. A weekend opens with time available, yet nothing reaches for it. The hours pass without friction, without anticipation. A workout ends in fatigue, but not satisfaction. The body is tired, yet something feels unfinished. Pleasure becomes procedural. Laughter happens, but it arrives a fraction late, as if it missed the moment it was meant to land. What is missing is difficult to name, because nothing obvious is broken. He is still capable, still productive, still reliable. So what exactly feels off? Is it exhaustion? Or is it the quiet realization that effort no longer leads to meaning? That time is being spent, but not experienced? He searches for explanations that preserve the story of who he is. Age becomes a convenient answer. Stress offers another. Responsibility fills the remaining gaps. These explanations feel logical. They protect identity. They suggest inevitability. If this is just how life goes, why question it? And yet, if the explanation is correct, why does it feel incomplete? From an omniscient distance, the pattern remains unchanged. There is no internal defect waiting to be repaired. No missing discipline. No motivational switch left unflipped. What has changed is the environment itself. It no longer demands engagement. It no longer asks for intensity. Sameness has replaced tension. Repetition has replaced consequence. And when nothing is at stake, why would the system invest energy? The body responds accordingly. Investment withdraws. Appetite fades. Desire dulls. Not as punishment, but as conservation. This is not burnout. Burnout announces itself loudly. This is erosion, quiet, cumulative, and easy to confuse with normal life. And isn't that what makes it dangerous? The fact that it blends in so well. There is no alarm to force attention. No breakdown to demand repair. Life continues to function. Responsibilities are met. The structure remains intact. And yet something essential is no longer present. Not ability, but urgency. Not competence, but hunger. Without hunger, days move forward cleanly and efficiently, while the man inside them grows increasingly distant from his own experience. If nothing appears wrong, how long does it take before fine becomes the problem? Think about this question. If what you feel is absence, not pain, why doesn't change begin with action? It begins with a clear perception of the pattern. The shift does not begin with action. It begins with perception. Almost against his will, he starts to see patterns that were previously invisible because they felt normal. The sameness of his mornings. The predictability of his reactions. The absence of moments that require a real decision. What once felt like control begins to feel like containment. And when containment replaces choice, what happens to initiative? This perception is unsettling because it removes the comfort of self-blame. If nothing is wrong with him, then something must be wrong with the structure he inhabits. That realization changes the nature of responsibility. No longer the responsibility to push harder, endure more, or optimize further, but the responsibility to see clearly what has been built and what it now produces. If the system is working exactly as designed, what does that say about the design itself? He notices how often he chooses the least demanding option, not out of fear, but out of habit. How quickly discomfort is smoothed over before it has time to teach anything. How rarely his environment asks him to respond with presence instead of procedure. Each observation sharpens awareness. The fog does not lift because energy has returned, but because attention has. And isn't attention the prerequisite for any real change? The life he constructed was optimized to reduce friction. At first, that optimization was useful. It created stability. It allowed progress. It protected against chaos. But over time, the same design removed contrast. When contrast disappears, reference points vanish. Without reference, urgency fades. Without urgency, engagement weakens. And without engagement, what is left besides maintenance? This is the moment where the story could collapse back into familiar explanations. Age, stress, fate. But perception has shifted just enough to prevent retreat. He sees that comfort has been uninterrupted for too long. Stability has become static. Safety has become a ceiling rather than a foundation. And once that is seen, how can it be unseen? Nothing has changed yet in his behavior. The calendar looks the same. The routine holds. But something fundamental has shifted in how he interprets his experience. What once felt like personal decline now appears as environmental consequence. Shame dissolves. Clarity replaces it. The question is no longer, what is wrong with me? It becomes, what has my life stopped asking of me? And once that question is asked honestly, can it ever be ignored again? Now think about which part of your routine no longer demands anything from you. Hold on to that thought. Change does not arrive as transformation. It arrives as friction. Small, deliberate interruptions in the automatic flow of life. He does not destroy what he built. He tests it. He applies pressure carefully, almost scientifically, to see what the system does when comfort is no longer guaranteed. If stability was designed, could stimulus be designed as well? The first disruptions are modest. A morning routine altered slightly. Silence replacing noise. A physical effort that demands more than maintenance. A conversation where disagreement is allowed to exist without being neutralized. These moments feel awkward at first. The discomfort is immediate and unmistakable. But is discomfort always a warning? Or can it be information the system hasn't received in a long time? Resistance appears quickly. The calendar tightens. Efficiency argues its case. Old habits pull with quiet authority. The impulse to return to ease is strong, not because the changes are harmful, but because the system has been trained to avoid friction. Comfort defends itself convincingly. It reminds him how well things were working, how predictable life felt, how safe it all was. And yet, something else begins to happen. Attention sharpens in brief flashes. The present moment gains weight. Sensations register more clearly. The body responds before the mind has time to rationalize. This is not motivation. It is engagement. Engagement returns before enthusiasm ever does. And isn't engagement the signal the system has been waiting for? He notices that effort starts to feel meaningful again when it is no longer optional. When physical strain asks something real of him, the body responds with clarity rather than resistance. When decisions carry consequence, thought sharpens. When outcomes are uncertain, presence becomes necessary. The system wakes up not because it is forced, but because it is needed. These experiments do not announce themselves as change. They feel small, almost insignificant, but they interrupt the pattern. An interruption is enough to destabilize a system that has been running on predictability alone. The life remains functional. Responsibilities are still met. Stability is not destroyed. But comfort is no longer uninterrupted. And in that interruption, something essential begins to wake up. Notice where friction still feels threatening rather than informative. Don't remove it yet, just observe it. The return of energy does not announce itself. There is no surge, no sudden sense of being fixed. Instead, it accumulates quietly, almost beneath awareness. Sleep begins to feel more complete, not because it lasts longer, but because it finally restores. Mornings carry more weight. The body rises with less resistance, even when circumstances remain unchanged. Something subtle has shifted in the background. Decisions begin to matter again, not with urgency, but with gravity. Choices no longer feel interchangeable. Conversations regain texture. Words land with intention instead of habit. Physical effort stops draining him and starts returning something in exchange. The body responds to being asked for something real, something that cannot be optimized away. Testosterone, in this sense, is not an abstract number or a symbol of dominance. It is experienced as clarity, as assertiveness without aggression, as focus without tension. The hunger for exertion returns, not because of discipline or obligation, but because the system recognizes usefulness again. Energy flows toward what matters when what matters finally demands energy. There are setbacks. Comfort pulls hard. Old patterns reassert themselves with familiarity and ease. Some days slide backward into autopilot. This is not failure. It is evidence of how deeply the previous structure shaped behavior. The difference now is awareness. The slide is noticed. The pattern is named. And naming changes the trajectory, even when behavior briefly returns to form. Progress remains quiet. It does not seek attention or validation. It compounds through consistency rather than intensity. The system recalibrates slowly, responding to repeated signals of engagement. Rhythm replaces force. Presence replaces urgency. Strength returns without spectacle. From the outside, life still looks the same. The calendar still functions. Responsibilities are still handled. Stability remains intact. But inside, something fundamental has shifted. Energy is no longer something he chases with effort. It is something that responds when the environment asks him to show up. The man does not feel reborn. He feels reconnected. Reconnected to effort that matters. To challenges that sharpen rather than exhaust. To days that register as lived rather than managed. What returns is not youth. It is relevance. Pay attention to the moments when your efforts begin to pay off. Don't amplify them yet. Just observe. From the outside, very little appears different. The structure of life remains intact. Responsibilities are still met. The calendar still holds. Stability has not been destroyed, but it no longer sedates. Friction has been reintroduced deliberately, not as chaos, but as demand. The system now has something to respond to, something that cannot be optimized away without cost. Inside, identity shifts quietly. He moves from maintaining life to engaging with it. Days regain texture. Weeks become distinguishable again. Time stops feeling like a smooth surface and begins to show contours. Effort feels consequential. Rest feels earned rather than scheduled. Presence replaces efficiency as the primary signal of a day well lived. When presence is required, attention follows. When attention follows, energy answers. The final insight settles without drama, but it does not fade. Nothing was ever wrong with him. There was no hidden defect, no missing trait, no personal failure waiting to be corrected. His life simply stopped requiring him. And when a man is no longer required, his energy recedes. When requirement returns, energy follows. Not instantly, not perfectly, but reliably. This understanding reframes everything. Fatigue is no longer a verdict on character. Low drive is no longer a mystery. It becomes information, feedback pointing outward rather than inward. The question is no longer how to fix himself, but how to design a life that continues to ask something real of him. What challenges are necessary? What comforts need limits? What routines deserve friction built in by design? Comfort is no longer the enemy, but it is no longer unquestioned. Stability remains valuable, but but it is no longer sufficient on its own. The system now includes contrast intentionally, small challenges that cannot be postponed, uncertainty that carries consequence, decisions that demand presence. These elements keep the structure alive rather than static. They ensure the system never forgets how to respond. The work does not end here. It cannot. Awareness, once gained, does not allow a return to blindness. The pattern has been seen. The cost of sameness is understood. Each choice now carries context with it. Each routine is examined not only for efficiency, but for what it asks of the man who lives inside it. The story closes without resolution because resolution would imply completion. This is not an ending. It is a permanent shift in perception. Life still functions, but it now requires presence. And when presence is required, energy answers. Faca uma pausa e pergunta si mesmo. O que sua vida deixou de exigir de você?
One morning, I tried an exercise that I had avoided for years. Sitting still in complete darkness, eyes closed, doing nothing but tuning into sensations within. At first, restlessness clawed at my focus, a buzzing urge to fill the silence with distractions or action. But after several deep breaths, a profound softness emerged, a spaciousness within that contrasted sharply with my habitual urgency. In that quiet space, I glimpsed what had been extinguished beneath layers of restraint. Curiosity, creativity, a latent spark waiting patiently. That afternoon, I sketched a simple diagram mapping out factors disrupting flow in my life. Pressure to perform, digital overwhelm, emotional suppression, and the inability to ask for help. By charting these interconnections, I could begin dismantling habits piece by piece. A giant emerged from the shadows, my resistance to vulnerability, which disguised itself as strength but fed exhaustion. Admitting this felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, but it also opened doors that had long been barricaded. The following days brought small breakthroughs. Incorporating brief mindful pauses during hectic schedules, I felt subtle shifts, a tightening easing in the shoulders, a dulled mind sharpening, a fragmented sense of self knitting back together. These pockets of presence became my secret weapons, reaffirming that healing energy thrives on intentional attention to moments most overlooked. Another pivotal moment came unexpectedly during a community gathering. When I spoke honestly about these struggles, I witnessed empathy ripple through the room, dissolving the isolation I'd silently carried. Stories surfaced, others' experiences of quiet depletion and reemergence, painting a mosaic of shared human endurance and revival. It was an embrace without judgment, proof that the path toward internal freedom is rarely walked alone. As I kept navigating this terrain, I understood that reclaiming vigor involves decoding a complex interplay between external demands, internal scripts, emotional wounds, and physiological responses. It's a layered process requiring patience, curiosity, and courage. Change doesn't come from willpower alone, but from embracing paradoxes. Strength in softness, movement in stillness, and growth in surrender. Now, when I reflect on this journey, I see how essential it is to cultivate an inner environment rich with compassion and awareness, allowing natural energy cycles to resurface. I invite you to experiment with moments of intentional rest, tiny islands of peace amid chaos, and observe how they ripple into your sense of aliveness. Notice what emerges when you stop battling unseen pressures and instead lean into your own rhythms. What stories does your inner world begin to tell when you meet it openly and without resistance? The answers lie there, quietly waiting to be heard. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at an unseen crossroads, the air thick with possibility yet tinged with a quiet urgency. It's as if the paths before me wind through a forest where shadows and light dance in nuanced rhythms, sometimes deceptive, sometimes revealing. Each step I took peeled back layers not just of fatigue or tension, but of intricate tapestries woven deep within me, echoing stories I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. There's a gravity here that pulls me inward and simultaneously urges me outward, creating a subtle tension between surrender and action. I remember the sensation of sitting with uncertainty, resisting the urge to leap toward quick fixes or superficial answers. Instead, I learned to inhabit that space of not knowing with a kind of deliberate attention, like waiting for a wave to crest before catching its momentum. It wasn't an easy posture, demanding both patience and courage, a willingness to confront a strangely quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. This tempest wasn't loud or dramatic, but relentless. A slow erosion of vitality that whispered questions instead of shouting commands. In these moments, I heard an unfamiliar language emerging, an internal dialogue stitched from whispers and hesitations that invited me to explore what lies at my core. This language was subtle, weaving in threads of vulnerability and strength, challenging me to relinquish old narratives that no longer served. It felt as if an invisible compass was guiding me, not toward destinations marked by external accolades or accomplishments, but toward something more elemental, a reclamation of presence, grounded in authenticity rather than performance. There were times when the pull to retreat into familiar patterns, busy schedules, relentless doing was strong, a siren beckoning with the false promise of control. Yet deep inside, a countercurrent was growing, urging me to trust rhythms that honor depth and replenishment. The delicate tension between these impulses created a fertile tension, inviting me to reimagine what resilience truly entails. It wasn't about unyielding toughness or unrelenting grind. Instead, it sought integration, a seamless dance between energy and recovery, tension and release. I often found myself by a quiet window during twilight hours, observing how the fading light softened the edges of the world outside, blurring distinctions and inviting reflection. Those evenings mirrored an internal shift, where the rigidity of old defenses dissolved enough to reveal a realm suffused with possibility. It was as though the dusk carried a message encoded in its golden hues. Transformation seldom announces itself with fanfare but unfolds steadily, quietly, in the space left by letting go. Conversations along the way unfolded like unexpected gifts, moments of resonance that awakened dormant aspects within me. Some words shared by others struck chords that few could hear, yet their echoes lingered, weaving a richer understanding of what it means to inhabit this complex tension of endurance and awakening. These exchanges were not mere dialogue. They were encounters with facets of my own being reflected back through empathetic eyes, urging me toward a fuller embodiment of strength informed by softness. The process revealed itself as layered and intricate, defying linear progression. There were days when progress felt tangible, a surge of clarity breaking through the fog, while other times the path seemed obscured, swallowed in mist. Yet through both ease and resistance, I came to recognize that true transformation often unfolds in cycles, spirals winding deeper into self-awareness, looping back with new insight and renewed intention. I became increasingly sensitized to undercurrents within, not as problems to fix but as messengers carrying wisdom long overshadowed by distractions and obligations. A curious shift took hold, replacing self-judgment with curiosity, rigidity with openness. It was a quiet revolution that gradually dismantled the barriers between guarded survival and expansive living. What once seemed like immovable walls softened into thresholds awaiting passage. As I sit with this unfolding awareness, I realize the journey ahead demands neither haste nor harshness. It calls instead for tenderness, an invitation to meet all parts of myself with respect and patience, honoring the paradoxes within. It asks for both humility and boldness, a willingness to inhabit discomfort as fertile ground for growth. In this way, each moment becomes an opportunity to translate insight into embodiment, transforming abstract understanding into lived experience. This evolving relationship with myself feels less like mastering a puzzle and more like learning a dance, one where attunement and response create fluid harmony rather than static control. The dancers on this stage are varied. Resilience steps forward, vulnerability twirls alongside, and strength finds shape not by dominance but through balance. Witnessing this interplay deepens my appreciation for the subtle alchemy at work when tension and ease coalesce to generate new life within. I invite you to linger here beside me in this space of unfolding and anticipation, where the threads of inquiry and awakening intertwine. There is a palpable energy humming beneath the surface, a readiness to move beyond patterns that have long constrained us toward a terrain ripe with possibility. The horizon glimmers faintly in the distance, not as a fixed endpoint, but as an invitation into continued exploration and profound reconnection. There was a quiet evening when I finally allowed myself to slow down, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, almost urgent need to listen. The air around me was still, and the usual blur of thoughts began to dissolve, revealing a clearer space within. In that rare stillness, I confronted an essential truth that had been silently shaping so much of my existence. Endurance that doesn't acknowledge limits quietly erodes the essence of who I am. I realized that surviving day to day, pushed by endless demands and unrelenting tension, formed a veil that kept me from fully inhabiting my own life. I can see now how, over time, a pattern had emerged, a reflex that set my energy reserves on hold, holding back parts of myself from unleashing their full force. It was survival disguised as strength, an internal agreement to settle for just enough to keep up appearances. But this subtle concession wasn't benign. It acted as a slow leak in the reservoir of vitality, sapping power that once propelled me toward growth, desire, and presence. There was no dramatic collapse, no singular failure, only the quiet diminishing of fire, smothered by constant low-grade strain. More than once, I questioned whether this was simply the price to pay for living in a world that demands so much. Yet, as I peeled back these layers, a different story emerged. One of possibility to reclaim aliveness by tuning into unrecognized signals and honoring the rhythms that replenish life's breath. It became clear that the absence of immediate crisis doesn't preclude a profound internal emergency, a depletion that happens in slow motion, its contours easily overlooked because it hides in plain sight. Sitting in a moment of reflection, I remember telling a close friend, "I think I've been living halfway, not fully asleep, but not awake either." The honesty resonated deeply between us, exposing a collective experience too often ignored. What if the widespread fatigue and muted desire we witness isn't a sign of weakness but a call to reconnect with a deeper, wiser source of strength? What if real power emerges from learning to recognize when to push and, critically, when to surrender? This insight opened a new chapter, a recognition that genuine vitality isn't a fixed state to be forced or manufactured. Instead, it's an unfolding dance with attention and care, a willingness to embrace vulnerability as an entry point into endurance that sustains rather than depletes. The fierce inner tension gave way to a gentler, more fluid presence that invited me not to armor up but to soften, to open, to move from survival into invitation. I recall a day when, despite the noise of life pulling me in every direction, I chose to sit quietly and breathe with intention. The practice wasn't magic. It was subtle and patient, a gradual coaxing of energy back into circulation. What surprised me was how little this required in sheer effort, yet how grand the unfolding was. A slow blooming of clarity, a return of appetite for possibility, a reawakening of the hunger for life. The lesson I carry with me now is this: resilience forged in isolation and endless striving is fragile. True strength grows from weaving moments of calm into the fabric of our days and creating environments that invite replenishment. Reclaiming presence means reclaiming the right to inhabit every cell with awareness and acceptance, letting go of chipped expectations to embrace authentic flourishing. I sense this is not the end of a battle but the beginning of an ongoing conversation. A dialogue that asks me to be both gentle and vigilant, to hold tenderness and ferocity side by side. There is no final destination here, only a continual unfolding toward greater alignment with the vitality inherently within reach when armored defenses relax. If you find yourself echoing the quiet struggles that propelled me here, I offer this. Lean into the spaces that beckon for ease. Listen deeply to the whispers calling for restoration. Begin to cultivate practices that honor rhythm and renewal. In doing so, you don't just break free from a cycle of diminishing returns. You rediscover what it means to occupy your presence fully with courage and grace. And as I write these words now, I feel a quiet hope stirring. A promise that the path out of exhaustion and toward vibrant living isn't found in battling harder, but in awakening steadily. There is no rush, only the unfolding capacity to return. Not to what was lost, but to what has patiently awaited your arrival all along.